In our last two lectures, we have looked at the idea and reality of freedom in the Roman Empire. We have seen how the concept of freedom as freedom to live as you choose, protected by an efficient central government, realized a standard of living for the ordinary citizen of the empire greater than would be achieved again until our own century. Today we want to ask the question, why that great empire declined and fell. And we want to look at that question in two forms, image and reality. For the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was an event of such extraordinary significance, felt throughout the length of Europe, that generation after generation has reinterpreted. It's like the story of Jesus of Nazareth or Alexander the Great. It becomes an event in itself into which each generation reads its own hopes and aspirations and values, criticizes and justifies. Moreover, that justification and attempt to explain the fall of the Roman Empire would find statements that would in themselves become cultural objects of extreme importance. The first of these, in our own terms, is that of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, first in importance. And we will examine why, at the time of the American Revolution, the minds of men and women were fixed upon why the Roman Empire declined and fell, and what Gibbon saw in it as lessons for his own day and the British Empire. But the second question is, what really happened? Why did the Roman Empire decline and fall? And that, too, has profound significance for us. The founders, as we have seen, believed that the reason for studying history was to make decisions in your own day. And when we looked at Pompeii, we stressed the similarities between lifestyle, political conceptions, political reality in the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd century A.D. and our own days. And we will look carefully at parallels between why Rome fell and our own society and our own image of ourselves as the only superpower. People looked back to the fall of Rome. For centuries to come, Europe would try to recapture that unity that had been Rome. And they looked back not because of academic definitions of freedom, they looked back because they understood people had lived better then than they had ever lived before, and they had ever lived after. They looked back because of the realities of what we saw in Pompeii in the 1st century A.D. and what can be seen all over the Roman Empire in the 2nd century A.D. in the great cities stretching from London out to Antioch. So it was the reality of good living and how one enjoyed freedom to live as you choose that made people look back to Rome. So it would be that one of the most perceptive students of the Roman Empire and its fall would be seated upon steps we could still go to in Rome, on the church of Santa Maria in Araceli on the Capitoline Hill, seated there on October the 15th in 1764, Edward Gibbon. And he was looking out over what had been the Forum of Rome. But in these days, 1764, it was called the cow pasture. Just a few columns stuck up, and sheep and goats and cows roamed among it grazing. And there were hovels built all around the columns. And it was a scene of complete desolation in a fairly squalid city. And as Gibbon sat there, he saw coming out of the church of Santa Maria in Araceli a group of barefoot monks chanting Vespers. And he asked himself the question, why did the grandeur of Rome, why did the Forum where Cicero had spoken and Caesar made his politics, why had it become a cow pasture? And he believed it was due to the triumph of barbarism and Christianity. And he set about to write what would become the greatest history in the English language, a masterpiece of English prose, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he chose to write it in that very period in which the Americans were beginning their great revolt from Britain. And in fact, the first volume of his history would come out in 1776, in February, right before the Declaration of Independence. And the volumes would span the period from the Declaration of Independence to the ratification of the Constitution. This is no coincidence. It is because Gibbon and his contemporaries saw in the fate of the Roman Empire parallels to the fate of the British Empire. And they saw that the decline and fall of the Roman Empire addressed the central, most pressing question of their own day, the fate of liberty. Gibbon was born to considerable wealth and advantages in Britain. He liked to look back, and in his autobiography, and his autobiography is one of the most charming works of its kind in any language. And he looked back to his birth as being one of great good fortune. For he was born in England in the reign of liberty, 1737. The Constitution was firm on the basis of liberty. Parliament controlled affairs. It was truly an age of constitutional liberty and ordered liberty, a phrase he loved. And he was born in affluent circumstances. Not terribly wealthy, not an aristocrat, but never in his life did he worry about money. He had the money to study and to live the kind of life that he chose, which gave him a real understanding of this definition of freedom as freedom to live as you choose. His father sent him off to Oxford, and Gibbon would later look back upon his days at Oxford as the most dismal intellectual period in his life. The monks of Oxford, as he called his teachers, steeped in port. He matriculated at Magdalen College. He had been sickly as a youth and not gone to the regular kind of prep schools, and had spent much of his time in his grandfather's library, arriving at Magdalen, as he said, with an amount of erudition that would have amazed a scholar and given shame to a schoolboy. But he found the time at Oxford to be an easygoing experience. That is to say, he met with his tutor the first time, and the tutor gave him an assignment, and he came back with it done dutifully, and the tutor went over it in a perfunctory manner. Second time, the same. Third time, he really hadn't prepared it well. The tutor didn't care. Fourth time, he didn't show up and wrote a formal excuse. Tutor took it. Fifth time, he didn't show up, didn't write an excuse, and the tutor didn't say a word either. And so he passed his first terms at Oxford, idling away. But he said that was good fortune. For had he been subjected to the stultifying terms of education in an English university at those days, he never would have become the historian of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But in these idle times, he turned to religion, and he began to investigate Catholicism. If there were one thing he could do that would outrage his father, he would become a Catholic. In those days, of course, Catholics could not hold office. Catholics couldn't go to Oxford, Cambridge, and take a degree. And so he converted secretly. And when his father found out about it, not only was Gibbon taken out of Oxford, but shipped off to Lausanne, where he would sit at the feet of a Calvinist minister. He would soon reconvert to Protestantism after a fashion in a formal way, though like most educated men of his time, he tended to be more of a deist, not terribly concerned with rituals. But there he began his serious education. French would become a second mother tongue to him. He would learn Latin extremely well and learn Greek extremely well. And he would begin to refine his knowledge of history. So having reconverted, having finished up his education in this non-traditional fashion, he began to search about for an occupation. Not the kind of occupation we have, but some way to spend his time in a fruitful manner. For a short period during the 7 Years' War, there was fear that Britain would be invaded by France, and Gibbon joined the Hampshire militia as an officer. They didn't do much except march around, he said, but the experience was not without value for the historian of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. He traveled in Europe, and it was there in 1764 that he conceived his idea for this great history. For he was determined to gain fame by writing. He searched around for other themes, but significantly all dealt with freedom. The history of the Florentine Republic, the history of the Swiss republics. But it was the decline and fall of the Roman Empire that fixed his attention. It was an age that admired Rome tremendously. The architecture breathed the spirit of Rome. We see it in Jefferson's home at Monticello, for example. It was an age which believed that the best poetry had been written by the Romans and could never be surpassed. It was an age in which Latin was at the fingertips of every educated person and a good solid knowledge of Greek as well. And it was an age fascinated by the political lessons of Rome, by the empire as much as by the republic. And so Gibbon set out to explain why the empire declined and fell. And he found the answer in the conception of liberty. For Gibbon, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was the sad fate of a nation that had lost its political liberty. When the book came out, Gibbon was a member of Parliament. He came into Parliament in 1774, a seat essentially purchased for him by his relative, and he would be drawn into the government of Lord North. Gibbon never made a speech in Parliament. As he said, the example of both the good and bad speakers deterred him. But I was a silent but attentive observer at the great debates of that time. I saw the chief public men of the age, men like Burke and Pitt, and I listened attentively to the supreme issue, the separation of the American colonies from Britain. And this time in Parliament was for me a school of civil prudence, the chief virtue of a historian. For Gibbon believed, like his ancient models, Tacitus and Polybius, that the reason for writing history, for reading history, was to learn how to make decisions in the present. And that is what he intended his history to be. He does not give open references to the troubles of Britain, though his letters are filled with them. And he writes on one occasion to a friend, I fear that I am making more progress with the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It makes me fearful because the decline and fall of the British Empire seems to be proceeding apace. He sided with the Americans, but Gibbon was also a realist. Lord North's government offered him a very nice stipend for writing a defense of British policy in French. He could write better French than anyone in Parliament. And when that worked well, then he took a sinecure on a committee and drew a very nice income and was, as he said, able to drink a better quality of port while he wrote off and finished his chapters. His understanding of the issue of freedom and its relation to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is painted in strong colors in the 3rd chapter at its beginning, the constitution of the Roman Empire in the age of the Antonines. It is a chapter filled with Augustus. For Gibbon, Augustus is the artful tyrant. In an earlier lecture, we mentioned that the British thinker and educator Alfred North Whitehead had said that only 2 times in history had a really difficult political problem been solved as nearly perfectly as fashioned. One was with the founders of our country, one was with Augustus. Now that would have made the founders of our country roll in their graves to be compared to Augustus. Because Augustus, for them as he was for Gibbon, was the supreme example of the corrupt politician who corrupts his own citizen body in order to obtain absolute authority. Gibbon is like Tacitus, his model. For him, the Roman Empire of the Caesars began in hypocrisy, fraud, and violence. And that Augustus was a tyrant who allowed the facade of the Constitution to exist while grasping all real power in his own hands. Thus, for Gibbon, Augustus corrupted the provinces, the military, the ordinary Roman citizen. And they allowed themselves to be corrupted. They allowed themselves to give up their freedom. The provinces wanted nothing more than a leisurely, quiet life. And the ordinary Roman citizen in Rome enjoyed seeing the aristocratic Senate humiliated. And so, having bought off everyone with the sweet repose of peace, Gibbon writes, Augustus professed himself to be the first citizen of his country. The very language professed himself to be shows the artful craft. The language of Gibbon is unsurpassed. Winston Churchill's powerful rhetoric came from memorizing whole passages of Gibbon's powerful prose. And this first volume, when it came out, describing the rise of Augustus and the tyranny of Augustus, was an immediate bestseller. Gibbon said, "I awoke to find myself famous. My book was on every coffee table and in almost every toilet in England." It was a success due to more than his prose, more than the unsurpassed grandeur of his narrative chapters, more than to the titillating details of his footnotes. It was due to the fact that men and women on both sides of the Atlantic saw that it addressed this supreme question of freedom. And in the beginning of his third chapter on the Constitution in the Age of the Antonines, Gibbon writes that the only barrier that prevents a monarch from turning into an absolute tyrant is to be found in a martial nobility and a stubborn commons, possessed of arms, tenacious of property, and gathered into constitutional assemblies. That was the message. That was exactly what was happening in America. Gibbon from time to time raises his curtain. He says that if a historian does not protest against tyranny, then he loses his moral claim to right. And he also says, writing further on about the empire in its later stages, if the Roman, at the central government level, had been willing to establish in every province a legislative body drawn from the provincials that would handle all internal matters, above all taxation, the Roman Empire would have endured forever, supported by the arms of free men. So it's quite clear where he stood. And he would be quoted in Parliament. On one occasion, a parliamentarian turning to Gibbon and said, "How can you write this and yet still support Lord North?" In 1781, with the defeat of Cornwallis, Lord North's government fell and Gibbon found himself out of Parliament. His relative would not buy him another seat, and he would move to Lausanne and finish off the final volumes of this mighty and influential work. Now, for Gibbon, the issue was that of liberty. And he believed that even at the height of the Roman Empire, it was being eaten away, its vitals gnawed at, to use his phrase, by a secret cancer. And that cancer was the loss of political liberty. The Roman Empire had been motivated by civic virtue. And Gibbon believed that civic virtue had been lost amidst the expansion of the empire. Gibbon was no Democrat. He believed that true freedom would be lost the more the rights of citizenship were expanded. And so he began to trace the fall of the empire from the early part of the 1st century BC, when the Roman citizenship had been expanded all over Italy. But secondly, the failure of the Romans to continue their citizen army. To Gibbon, a militia, of the kind we found in North America. This was the best guarantee for freedom. And the Romans had risen to empire based on a martial common people, guided by a balanced constitution. And when the Romans, again in the early 1st century BC, abandoned the militia system for a standing army, the progress to the loss of liberty was hastened. And again, Gibbon shared, the founders of our country, profound distrust of a standing army. He believed that liberty must be ordered, it must be liberty under law, and his chapter on the Roman law in the time of Justinian is one of the most brilliant summaries of the contribution of the Romans to jurisprudence ever written. Gibbon knew the ancient maxim that luxury corrodes, and knew the understanding that Rome had tarnished its freedom by its importation of affluence and luxury from its vast empire. But he enjoyed luxury too much to condemn it. And he writes that while rhetoricians of all ages have condemned luxury, a more rational approach is that luxury doesn't do much harm and may even do good by letting benefits filter down and economic advantages to the lower classes, a view he shared with his friend Adam Smith. So Gibbon took the great issue of his day, political freedom, and made it the centerpiece of his understanding of why the Roman Empire declined and fell. In ages past, different generations had found different reasons. To the age of the 4th and 5th century AD, it was wickedness. And Christian writers like Salvian ranted against the wickedness of their own day, which was bringing about the wrath of God. For those who remained pagans, it was the desertion of the pagan gods of Rome themselves that had turned the wrath of heaven upon the Roman people. But I think we can, while realizing that every approach we take to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire will be colored by our own views, nonetheless can look back and assign our own reasons. And they start from the fact that the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was not due to any one operating principle, but to a series of decisions made at critical moments. And the most far-reaching of these decisions lay in foreign policy. See, the Romans of the 1st and 2nd century A.D., the ordinary Roman, was much like Americans today, did not want to be bothered about foreign policy. But in fact, despite all the achievements of the Roman system, its peace, its prosperity, the superb leaders who were brought up generation after generation, men of the quality of Caesar and Augustus, Vespasian and Titus, Domitian, Trajan and Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, men so great who established such an efficient system that the occasional crazy like Caligula or Nero was hardly a blip upon the screen of imperial progress. These great leaders and their advisors never solved two fundamental issues of foreign policy. Issues which today, in our own terms, we might call the Middle East and Eastern and Central Europe. The Roman Empire was not the only superpower. In the days of Caesar and continuing, to the east, beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, lay the great empire of Persia, Parthia, stretching out all the way to Afghanistan, to the shores of the Indus River, encompassing what is Turkestan today. It was a well-organized, highly efficient, and technologically superb imperial structure. Its army, in some ways, was technologically superior to the Romans. The Romans continued to rely on their infantry, and the Parthians, or Persians, made use of mounted archers and heavy armed cavalry, the precursor of medieval knights. And the Romans could not stand up to their charges and to their flights of arrows. And the attempts to tame the Parthians had ended in disaster at Carrhae in 53 BC and 16 years later under Mark Antony. To the north lay the Germans, divided into numerous tribes, but fiercely independent and ferocious warriors. And to the Roman author Tacitus in the 2nd century, the Germans had that civic virtue that the Romans had once possessed. And his Germania, much read by the founders of our country, described in detail the freedom of the Germans, living in houses apart from one another. They liked to live so that they could not see the smoke from their neighbor's fire, wearing their hair long in the sign of freedom, the right to bear arms being the distinguishing mark of a German free men, choosing their leaders for their warlike bravery, not for their heredity, deciding all matters of war and peace in a single great assembly of all free men. It's a precursor of the Parliament, in which they made their decisions drunk and sober. If a decision seemed good when they were sober, they would reconsider it when they were drunk. If they made a decision when they were drunk, they would reconsider it when they were sober. And their fairest love was to spend their day sleeping and their evenings drinking to huge excess, and fighting. For no German was a full-fledged member of the tribe until he'd killed his first man, bathed his face in their blood, and shaved his baby face. So they were warriors. And they were a constant pressure upon the borders of Rome. It had been pressure by the Germans in Gaul that had led Caesar to his great Gallic conquest. And Caesar, genius that he was, understood the danger of the Germans and the Parthians. When he was assassinated in March of 44 BC, he was in the midst of planning a 3-year campaign against the Parthians and the Germans. He planned to conquer and annex Persia, then come back by the Caspian Sea and break the power of the Germans. But he died before he could realize this. Augustus was a far more prudent statesman. He looked upon the defeats of the Romans at Carrhae and under Mark Antony as clear indications the Romans, without a major transformation of their military structure, could not defeat Parthia. And so with much show and propaganda, he arranged a treaty with the Parthians and struck a balance of power. Augustus did try to conquer the Germans, but after one bloody defeat in 9 AD under the German war chief Arminius at the Teutoburger Forest, Augustus would withdraw and leave behind to his successor the admonition, do not try to expand the borders of the empire. And so it would remain. The Emperor Trajan understood the importance of defeat and annexation of Parthia in Germany. His campaign against the Dacians, which we saw immortalized on his columns, was one such securing of the Danubian frontier. And he ended his life in the east on a campaign against Parthia. But his successor again, Hadrian, gave up these conquests. Once again, he reached a balance of power agreement with the Parthians, and then, along the northern frontier, literally sought to wall the barbarians out. The Great Wall of Hadrian, still running across northern Britain, the greatest single Roman monument north of the Alps, is this testimony to his belief that he could wall out foreign policies, just like his frontier of stone along the Rhine and the Danube. But foreign policy cannot be walled out. And in the late 2nd and 3rd century, both frontiers would break. The Parthians would raid again and again into the fairest provinces of the east, and the Germans would ravage with fire and sword Gaul, penetrating as far as Italy. The Roman government tried to respond, but its response was to undermine the very foundation that had made the empire so successful. Instead of paying 2 taxes a day, instead of working 2 days a year to pay your taxes, by the 3rd century, most of your time was spent working to pay your taxes. A vast increase in taxation, a large, ever more inefficient bureaucracy, a large, ever more inefficient army was created, and more taxes to pay for the bureaucracy and the army. And the result was not to stop the barbarian invasions, but simply to lure them further into the Roman Empire. Iran in the middle of the 3rd century would become revitalized by religious fundamentalism. And a Roman emperor would be carried off into captivity to be skinned alive and his dyed skin hung up in a temple of the great god Ahura Mazda. And the Germans would first ravage again and finally begin to dismember the western part of the empire. And so would begin to arise the modern states of France, Frankreich, the land of the Franks, England, the land of the Angles and Saxons, and even Spain would fall under barbarian rule. The Roman Empire fell because of these failures of foreign policy, these failures to act resolutely in the time of Augustus and again in the time of Trajan, to solve with finality these 2 frontier issues. That was the catalyst and ultimate cause, which then precipitated the taxation and bureaucracy that sapped the ordinary Roman citizen's belief and confidence. It had been the middle class which supported the empire, and the vast taxations of the 3rd and 4th century made them lose first their confidence and then even their loyalty in the imperial government. I say to you that if we could bring Julius Caesar back to give us a lesson in this lecture, he would say that our refusal to act with finality, first at the time of the Iranian hostage controversy and then at the time of the Gulf War, has left us with a bitter legacy, a harvest that we will one day reap in the Near East. And Caesar would also say that Russia is a superpower. Do not delude yourself. They are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. They have a foreign policy with a tradition that is chauvinistic, xenophobic, and expansionistic. They feel a deep humiliation at what they see as our betrayal, our refusal to go in with something like a Marshall Plan after they had rid themselves of communism, our failure to create an economic structure that would make democracy finally viable in that unhappy land. And they would say, you cannot wall out the problems of foreign policy. And that our current failure to have a systematic foreign policy may bring back the fruits of the fall of Rome.